Subcommittee will come to order. We are meeting today to consider H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome everyone to today's Subcommittee on Communications and Technology markup of legislation to address a problem that we have all had firsthand experience with, robocalls. Unwanted robocalls have exploded, topping out at nearly 48 billion last year, a 60% increase in volume from the year before. That number is estimated to increase to 60 billion this year. And while some of these calls constituted legitimate alerts and reminders, such calls accounted for only 20% of the robocalls people receive each year. In the month of May alone, my hometown of Pittsburgh received an estimated 35 million robocalls. The problem has gotten so bad that Congressman Soto got robocalled in the middle of our legislative hearing on robocalls. So today, the subcommittee will mark up Chairman Pallone's Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. Mr. Chairman, who were the ad wizards that come up with that clever name? Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, couldn't we have done a little better than that? Anyways, this legislation is a thoughtful response to the onslaught of billions of illegal robocalls Americans face every day. On average, everyone in this country receives 14 of these calls a day. This bill is a comprehensive bipartisan solution that I believe will help seriously reduce the number of robocalls consumers receive. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation, along with our colleagues, ranking members Walden and Latta. I'm also happy to see that language from the Support Tools to Obliterate Pesky Robocalls Act, or Stop Robocalls Act, see, that's a much better title for, with ranking member Latta and I introduced, was also included in the base text of this bill. So the bill before the subcommittee today is the result of bipartisan negotiations, which included industry and public interest stakeholders. I'm glad that these discussions have resulted in a strong bill that will help address this urgent issue. After ranking member Latta and I introduced the Stop Robocalls Act, which would have allowed phone carriers to enable robocall blocking services on customers' phone lines by default, the FCC moved forward to implement this proposal as part of a declaratory ruling. I'm glad to see the provisions in this bill would ensure that these services do not result in new consumer fees for robocall blocking services and provides redress for callers and consumers when a call is blocked incorrectly. Beyond these provisions, this bill does much to address many of the technological and regulatory shortfalls that have led to the rise in robocalls. The bill requires all carriers to adopt call authentication technology that would enable people to be certain that the number you see on your caller ID is really the number the call is coming from. All too often, people get calls that look like they are coming from just down the street, but which are actually coming from scammers half a world away. The bill also seeks to limit the number of nuisance robocalls consumers receive by ensuring that callers have consumers' consent before they robocall them, and it would require a series of rulemakings by the FCC to update their current rules to ensure that these rules protect consumers. The bill also extends the statute of limitations for illegal robocalls to ensure that federal authorities have sufficient time to take legal action against spammers and scammers who make these calls. All in all, this is a strong bill and a good compromise. It shows what Democrats and Republicans can accomplish when we put our heads together to address a critical issue, and I'm glad to be marking it up today. There are also a number of bipartisan amendments, including an amendment from Ms. Clark and Mr. Bilirakis on addressing the one-ring scam, and an amendment from Mr. McGeechan and Mr. Olson addressing the lack of criminal prosecution of illegal robocalls by the Department of Justice. There's also an amendment from Representative Butterfield, Johnson, Soto, and Gianforte regarding the industry-led trackback group, which works with the FCC to trace back the source of these illegal robocalls to help carriers identify and potentially block calls from carriers that facilitate illegal robocalling. Mr. Soto also has an amendment that would require the Attorney General to create an interagency working group to address robocalls offered on behalf of Mr. Chris, whose bill this is based on. I also understand that Ms. Eju has an amendment that we are still working on. I hope we can work together on that amendment as this bill goes to full committee. These are good amendments which I intend to support, and I encourage my colleagues to support the amendments and to support forwarding this bill onto the full committee. And with that, I yield back, and I now recognize our ranking member, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding today's very important hearing on this very important legislation. Today marks the beginning of congressional action to address one of the top issues I hear about from my constituents, stopping the scourge of illegal robocalls. We've all received an unwanted robocall, sometimes several times a day, and as the chairman stated, that someone right now on the dais might be getting a robocall. And usually these are illegally spoofed, making us think that it's a neighbor or a doctor's office is calling. So we answer. But rather than getting an important message, we hear a fake IRS recording and learn of some amazing deal we can't pass up on. This tactic, known as neighborhood spoofing, assumes that we are more likely to answer a phone call that appears to be local and is a key driver behind unwanted calls and texts to both wireline and wireless phones. These calls are disruptive and annoying, but they can also cause real damage to vulnerable populations who fall victim to these scams. With Americans receiving an estimated 48 million or billion robocalls each year, we need immediate solutions to take out illegal operators and provide relief to our consumers. After listening to my constituents concerned, I introduced the Stop Robocalls Act with the chairman, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, to prevent bad actors from fraudulently calling consumers by giving the FCC and private companies additional tools to block illegal calls. Our bill would help terminate illegal call operations by streamlining the process for private entities to share information with the Federal Communications Commission about scams and further industry efforts to trace back the source of unwanted robocalls. In addition to going after the root of the problem, our bill would also protect consumers by providing easier access to illegal robocall blocking technology through an opt-out approach. I'm pleased that my bill was already included in the legislation before us today, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. I'm glad that I've worked very closely with the chairman of the subcommittee and also with the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, and the ranking member, the gentleman from Oregon, to introduce this bipartisan effort, and I believe it will improve consumers' trust in our phone system and hinder bad actors' ability to scam vulnerable citizens. One important component to this legislation that distinguishes between legitimate and illegitimate callers and recognizes that we need to go after the bad actors. We all get annoyed by the overwhelming number of unlawful calls we receive, but we also rely on our phone system for many valuable pro-consumer messages. From school closures to prescription refills to bank fraud alerts, there are voice and text messages that consumers want and should not be blocked. We want to ensure that we are preserving customers' access to desirable and at times life-saving calls and text messages while also protecting them from bad actors who fraudulently spoof caller ID information to make illegal robocalls. At best, Americans find these robocalls pesky, and at worst, these illegal calls scam hard-working Americans out of their life savings. The FCC and the FTC have made great progress working with industry to help reduce the number of illegal robocalls Americans receive. Industry has also been actively working to protect consumers from unwanted robocalls by developing a set of procedures to authenticate caller ID information associated with telephone calls to combat unlawful caller ID spoofing. However, as technology continues to evolve, so do the tactics the bad actors use to illegally spoof numbers and make fraudulent robocalls. Despite our progress thus far, more work remains to be done to protect American consumers. That's why I'm glad that we are marking up the Stopping Bad Robocalls proposal today, because it will complement the work already being done. Again, I thank the chairman for working with me and the full committee ranking member and the full committee's chairman on this proposal, and I look forward to continuing the process to further strengthen this bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. It's now I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle, and I would note that in the effort to move as quickly as possible, you actually began the markup 3 minutes before 3, just so you know. Today, we're here to address a major concern of consumers, those annoying and illegal robocalls. The rising tide of illegal robocalls was once a nuisance, but it has grown to threaten the way consumers view and use their telephones. If we don't get a handle on them, I'm fearful robocalls will undermine our entire phone system. The American people are understandably fed up with robocalls, and who can blame them? One of my district's area codes received more than 20 million robocalls in May alone, according to UMail. That's a little over 7 calls per second, and that's outrageous. Some studies even estimate that nearly half of all calls this year will be scam calls. It's no wonder that people are refusing to answer calls from members or from numbers that they don't recognize, but each time a consumer chooses not to pick up the phone out of fear that a scam robocall is on the other end of the line, it chips away at our community and public safety. This problem is not only harmful to consumers, it also deeply affects many of our institutions. For example, at our legislative hearing, we learned that the Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida, received 6,600 scam calls in just 1 month, specifically designed to appear as calls coming from within the hospital. We've also heard similar stories of scammers disguised as the IRS looking to collect a debt, local governments or police departments, or loved ones in trouble looking for help. And we're even hearing about new scams like the One Ring scam, where fraudsters try to trick consumers into calling back international numbers in the hopes that the consumer will rack up charges. And all of these scams are different, and there won't be a silver bullet to fix them all. But that's why I'm pleased that so many members of the committee have drafted bipartisan legislation to help fix this problem. And I agree with Chairman Doyle that the one that we're considering today, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, is not actually one of the better named. I'm going to go through some of the others that actually do have better names, I must admit, including yours. But anyway, I was able to join with Ranking Member Walden on the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. This new bill represents a bipartisan agreement on comprehensive legislation to tackle both illegal and unwanted robocalls. Our bipartisan bill will implement a nationwide caller authentication system free for consumers so they can again trust that the number they see on their caller ID is actually the person calling them. It will also give consumers more help in controlling the unwanted calls they consistently receive. Consumers will also be able to block illegal and unwanted calls in a consistent and transparent way so that the calls people want are getting through. And our bill also gives law enforcement and the Federal Communications Commission the tools, information, and incentives to go after robocallers that break the law. So these are common sense and meaningful solutions that will put consumers back in control of their phones. And I thank Ranking Members Walden and Latta and Chairman Doyle for their work on this bipartisan bill. We will consider 4 bipartisan amendments that are based on bills that were introduced this year by other members. And again, they have better names. So Representatives Clark, Bilrakis, Van Drew, Fox, Rhoda, and Wahlberg have worked together to introduce the Ending One Ring Scams Act. And Representatives McEachin and Olson, Kim, Brooks, and Kustoff have introduced the Locking Up Illegal Robocallers Act. And Representatives Butterfield and Johnson, Soto, and Gianforte have introduced the Tracing Back and Catching Unlawful Robocallers Act. And Representatives Chris and Soto have been working together on legislation to create a spam calls task force to make sure hardworking civil servants across the government have their eyes trained on the robocall problem. And lastly, I want to thank Ms. Eshoo for raising awareness of the important consumer protection issues cited in her bill. This is my favorite, Anna, the Hang-Up Act. And that's also, I guess, well, that's Anna's, and then Jackie Spear has another bill, but that she's been working on. But she, of course, is not a member of our committee. So last, I want to thank the members and staff on both sides of the aisle for working together to produce legislation that is going to make a real difference for consumers. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. We now want to recognize Mr. Walden, Ranking Member of the Full Committee, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Mr. Latta and Chairman of the Full Committee, Mr. Pallone, on the legislation before us today. Our bipartisan bill has a name that truly fits its mission, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. I say that because I associate bad with illegal, and stopping illegal robocalls is a priority for me, and I think everybody on this committee, because it's a priority for our constituents as well. I was telling our council that I got one of those foreign things that said plus 31 and then under it Greece, and so I didn't answer it. That was the 14th of April of 17, but they did leave a voicemail. It turns out it was the Vice President of the United States and Air Force 2, so you know you miss a call every once in a while, but I saved the voicemail. Now, I don't know, it might have been a robocall, I don't know. Well, anyway, at the outset, I'd just like to point out this is not the first time this committee has acted on this issue. As you all know, last Congress, we held hearings and legislated against fraudulent robocalls and spoofing with the Ray Bombs Act. And this included reauthorizing the FCC for the first time in more than 2 decades to properly arm the Federal Communications Commission with the tools to go after such problems. And they're using those tools today. These actions all add up to better enabling consumers, carriers, law enforcement, and the Commission to target these scammers. We've held 22 town halls in my district so far this year, another 13 scheduled between now and the 4th of July. Nearly every one, somebody says, when are you going to do something else to stop these robocalls? They're a real pain. We all know the severity of this problem, and the sheer scope bears repeating. According to one study last year, 47.8 billion robocalls were placed nationwide. Apparently it's up to 25 billion this year already. That's 76 per person affected. Last month alone, 4.7 billion calls. Illegal robocalls affect life of every American, harmful ways, and you heard about the Cancer Center, the testimony that my friend from New Jersey referenced. This one medical center we also heard from registered more than 4,500 calls over a 2-hour period, according to the Washington Post. Legislation before us today addresses a problem faced by virtually everyone with a telephone. The Stopping Bad Robocalls Act takes the fight to robocalls on multiple fronts. It requires the phone carriers to implement call authentication technology so consumers can trust their caller ID once again, at no additional cost, by the way, to consumers, and includes a process to help rural carriers implement this technology. And when you receive a call from an unfamiliar number with a familiar area code, say 541 for Oregonians in my district, you should be confident there's a legitimate reason for that call. Our legislation takes steps to give consumers more confidence. We also get calls we don't want and that do not have any relevance to us personally or professionally. So our bill directs the Federal Communications Commission to issue rules to protect consumers for calls they did not agree to receive and to ensure consumers can withdraw consent from receiving calls they no longer want. The Stopping Bad Robocalls Act ensures the FCC has the authority and the tools to take strong, quick action when it tracks down robocallers. And so it includes extending the statute of limitations from 1 year to 3, in some instances 4 years for callers violating robocall prohibitions. And to be clear, those who carry out illegal robocalls are criminals and should be prosecuted as such. So our bill also allows carriers to offer call blocking services to consumers with no additional line charge on an opt-out basis, with important transparency safeguards to make sure important calls are not inadvertently blocked. And our legislation seeks to address the concern of legitimate callers from being unduly blocked. The FCC is required to enact rules to prevent companies from abusing those exemptions. This gets to a very important point. As we go after the bad guys, we must take care not to unintentionally cut off legitimate uses of auto-dialing technology. Auto-dialing technology is used to alert consumers of fraudulent use of their credit cards, provide notices, say, on school closures, or help people use ride-sharing services. We need to make a clear distinction in targeting those parties that have malicious intent as opposed to those who provide services that Americans rely upon every day. As we continue to work on the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, I'd just like to reiterate the importance of this work. We're addressing a telecommunications challenge that nearly every American consumer is facing. In fact, everyone in this room has probably been hit with a robocall already today. So I look forward to continue to work with my colleagues across the aisle to get this bill across the finish line and cut the line on illegal robocalls once and for all. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now, members are permitted to make opening statements in 3 minutes. I want to discourage people from doing that. I know you all have lots to say, and probably you all say something the same several times, but it is your right to speak for 3 minutes, and I will reluctantly recognize any member who seeks recognition to speak. Is there anyone on our side that seeks the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, you are recognized for 3 minutes and not a second less.
Well, I thank the chairman for recognizing my right to speak. And I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member and for this popular legislation. Today, Californians and Americans are seeing more unwanted calls than ever before. I often hear about this from my constituents, 43% of robocalls are reported to be illegal. I just got a robocall from my own cell phone number last week, so it's getting to be weird. From the perspective of consumers, it often seems that the best solution is just not to even pick up the call, and that does threaten our phone system to make it obsolete. Americans are demanding that we move forward with protecting consumers and that we will put a stop to these abusive practices. That's why I'm proud to co-sponsor the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, even though it's a bad name. And I look forward to seeing our committee advance this piece of legislation. Mr. Chairman, in an effort to gain your favor back, I'm going to yield back with 1 minute used.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any member on the Republican side that wishes to make an opening statement? Well, now, pay attention to this. Okay, let's look back. Ms. Eshoo, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
Did I miss
Chairman.
someone there? I'm sorry. Ms. Clark, I didn't see you there. You're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me begin by thanking you and our ranking member Lotta for holding this important markup. I'd also like to thank our full committee chairman, Mr. Pallone, and ranking member Walden for their leadership in this bipartisan effort. Today, our markup will address the intrusive reality and damaging repercussions of robocalls through H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. Not only are these calls illegal, but they have regularly stolen millions of dollars from the American people. One of the deceptive tactics being used to harm consumers is the one-ring scam. These con artists will call your phones, let the call ring once, and hang up. You're tricked into calling the number back, leaving you on the hook for additional charges on your next phone bill. Enough is enough. Time and again, the constituents from Brooklyn's 9th Congressional District have expressed their indignation about the threats they face in their homes as a result of one-ring scams. This is why I'm introducing an amendment to end one-ring scams, the Clark Amendment, based on the Clark-Bilirakis bill and partisan effort to ensure that the American scam culture. Before I close, Bilirakis for his leadership and my colleagues who are original co-sponsors of the base bill, Congressman Van Drew, Congresswoman Fox, Congressman Rauda, and Congressman Wahlberg. I'm proud that this subcommittee is getting things done for the American people. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Anyone change your mind over here? Okay. Chair now recognizes Ms. Eshoo for 3 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think if everyone in the country knew we were having a markup today, that we'd hear applause from across the country, because this is, it has to be the top consumer issue and with legitimacy, because it's an epidemic. Anyone that has a phone understands this issue. I'm pleased to co-sponsor 3375. I think the legislation is badly needed, and I'm glad that we have bipartisan support to put a dent in this national scourge. I've introduced 2 bills related to the subject matter. The Hang-Up Act, which closes a loophole that allows certain debt collectors to robocall legally. And I'm going to offer an amendment on this and share more information about it shortly. The other bill creates a robocall division at the FCC, and I think that the commission really needs to be organized around the most important consumer issue that they are challenged by. I'm really delighted that the committee report for the Financial Services at the Financial Services Committee directs the FCC to develop a detailed plan on creating a robocall division. I don't know how many members know that, but that's been adopted there, and I think that information will be important for us to understand how a division can be created. So I'm thrilled that we're taking up the bills, and I look forward to offering the amendment and discussing its importance. And I thank everyone, and it's just about every single member of this committee on both sides of the aisle that's been involved in ridding our nation of these illegal robocalls. So I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Anyone on the Republican side wish to speak? Okay, how about on the Democratic side? Wow. Okay, seeing no one else wanting to speak, we will conclude our opening statements. Pursuant to committee rules, members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. Please submit written opening statements to the clerk's desk. At this time, we'll begin consideration. The chair calls up H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3375, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to clarify the prohibitions
Without
on making
objection,
robocalls and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. We will start with bipartisan amendments. Is there any member seeking recognition to offer a bipartisan amendment? Chair recognizes Mr. McEachin. You have an amendment at the desk? And what's that amendment? Do you have the number or what's it labeled? Does the clerk have the amendment?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3359 offered by Mr. McEachin of Virginia.
Without
Page
objection,
21.
the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Dole and Chairman Pallone, for convening today's markup and introducing the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. Our constituents overwhelmingly support action to reduce unsolicited robocalls, and I'm proud to be working with you towards that goal. My amendment would dovetail nicely with the underlying bill by helping with the enforcement of existing criminal robocaller prohibitions. This amendment, identical to the Locking Up Robocallers Act I introduced last week with Mr. Olson, Mr. Kim, Mr. Kustoff, Mr. Brindisi, and Ms. Brooks, would require the FCC to report certain willful, knowingly repeated robocall violations to the Attorney General, ensuring that DOJ has better evidence with which to do its job and to enforce criminal robocaller prohibitions. This amendment would also require the FCC to publish and submit to this committee and the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation a report detailing the number of robocall violations reported to the Attorney General, as well as a general summary of the types of violations, ensuring that Congress is better able to perform its oversight duties. Current criminal enforcement efforts have not adequately curbed robocall scammers. By ensuring that the Attorney General has the evidence needed to better enforce prohibitions and bring criminal cases against these scammers, this amendment will work to discourage abusive robocalls from being placed in the first instance. I would like to thank Mr. Olson, Mr. Kim, Mr. Kustoff, Mr. Brindisi, Ms. Brooks, both chairman and ranking members and committee staff for their help on this amendment. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and the underlying bill. With that, I yield 1 minute to my Republican co-lead on this amendment, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
I thank my friend for yielding from the Commonwealth of Virginia and for working with me to introduce this amendment. The constant interruption from unwanted and illegal robocalls disrupt and aggravate all Americans. My parents, who are 80 years old, haven't answered the landline at home for over 5 years because of unwanted robocalls. This amendment ensures the FCC will provide valuable information to the Department of Justice so they can fully prosecute criminals who engage in deceptive and illegal robocall practices. I'm proud to work on this bipartisan issue to help Texans hang up the phone on harassing robocalls. Thank my friend and yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I would also like to yield 1 minute to one of our original co-sponsors, the gentle lady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks.
General lady's recognized. Is she here? Looks like Ms. Brooks has stepped out. Do you?
All right, well, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your patience and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, if there's no further debate, we will proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. All those opposed will signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to this legislation, bipartisan amendments? Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield.
is designated 13.
Gentleman seeks recognition to offer an amendment. Number 13, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered to H.R. 3375, offered by Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your continued efforts in preventing the spread of illegal robocalls. I think you're pretty serious about this issue, and I thank you so very much. These fraudulent calls, Mr. Chairman, are not only annoying, they have the potential to expose citizens to costly financial scams. The crooks behind these criminal calling operations are growing more sophisticated and efficient by the day. Some can make thousands of calls to thousands of numbers in a matter of seconds. Therefore, we must ensure that consumers are protected by acting to bring robo-scammers to justice. Yesterday, with the support of Mr. Johnson, Mr. Soto, Mr. Giannaforte, I introduced H.R. 3434, the Tracing Back and Catching Unlawful Robocallers Act of 19. Today, my friend Mr. Johnson and I offer this bill as an amendment to the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act to help end illegal calls and to end it permanently. This amendment requires the FCC to publish an annual report on the status of industry efforts and best practices to trace back suspected illegal robocalls to their origins. It also holds voice service providers accountable by allowing carriers to refuse calls from those providers who are not participating in the prevention efforts, incentivizing voice service providers to act in good faith and accordance with law. Every day, Mr. Chairman, consumers fall victim to scams initiated by deceptive calls. I believe that it would take a bipartisan effort here in Congress and the full cooperation of both the public and private sectors to implement and enforce a comprehensive solution to this very, very dangerous problem. At this time, if Mr. Johnson is here, I yield the balance of my time to my friend, Mr. Johnson from Ohio.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'm pleased to be a lead co-sponsor on H.R. 3434, the Tracing Back and Catching Unlawful Robocallers Act, with my colleague and friend, Mr. Butterfield. We are, as he mentioned, offering the text of this legislation as an amendment to H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act. Robocalls remain a serious issue, not only in my district in eastern and southeastern Ohio, but across the nation. I know personally how frustrating these unwanted calls can be. In addition to the potential harm that can be caused by fraudulent callers and scammers who take advantage of individuals answering these calls. This kind of illegal and harassing activity must stop, and I'm very pleased that this subcommittee is moving forward with legislation to protect consumers and prevent the growing surge of unlawful robocalls. As noted by my colleague, this amendment would require the FCC to outline a registered consortium to track private-led progress on call authentication. It requires the FCC to publish an annual report on the status of the telecommunication industry's private-led efforts to trace suspected illegal robocalls to their origins and the actions they have taken to coordinate with the FCC. Identifying the source of illegal robocalls is an important step in stopping the bad actors and preventing unwanted calls from reaching consumers. In order to encourage participation and accountability, the amendment would also require a publicly available list of voice service providers who are not adequately participating in efforts to prevent these illegal phone calls. I ask for the committee's support. I ask our colleagues to vote yes for this amendment, for this bipartisan amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Butterfield yields back. Is there anyone else seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Mr. Giannaforte, you're recognized.
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, I commend Chairman Pallone, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Walden, Ranking Member Latta for their work to find a consensus to protect our constituents from unwanted robocalls. The Stopping Bad Robocalls Act will require phone companies to provide call authentication technology, offer call blocking services, and will give the FCC more tools to track down bad actors at no additional cost to consumers. The legislation introduced by my friends Mr. Butterfield, Mr. Johnson, and myself would create a report on the private efforts of companies to implement traceback technology, its effectiveness, and which companies participate. This information has has to be published and accessible to the public. The report will also inform the FCC and Congress on the effects of private traceback efforts, as well as repeated bad actors who assist in the transmission of illegal and unwanted robocalls. This amendment will only strengthen H.R. 3375, the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, and I urge adoption. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, if there's not further debate, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to this legislation? Further bipartisan amendments? For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And do you have your amendment number? What is it labeled?
It is labeled 39, number 39, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3375, offered by Ms. Clark of New York. Page 21 after line
Without
11.
objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentlewoman is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bipartisan amendment is an effort to stop one-ring scams to protect the American people from the scam culture of robocalls. It requires the FCC to initiate proceedings to protect consumers from one-ring scams 30 days after bill passage and provide a report to Congress on their work. The Commission will consider the following. 1, how to best work with federal and state law enforcement agencies to put a cop on the beat and address bad actors, both foreign and domestic, who seek to harm consumers. 2, incentives for voice service providers to stop calls made to perpetuate the issue. 3, ways to work with entities that provide call blocking services and engage them in the discussion. And 4, lastly, educational options for consumers to learn how to avoid one-ring scams in coordination with the FTC. I want to thank all of my colleagues for their work on this amendment and on this bill. I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I thank the chairman for bringing up the bill. I thank Mrs. Clark, of course, for introducing this amendment based off the Clark-Bilirakis Ending One-Ring Scams Act. One-ring call scams are the latest in the evolving strategies of illegal robocallers. By adopting this amendment, we will show how serious Congress is in combating bad actors' new tactics. Robocallers are always a step ahead in trying to defraud Americans of billions of dollars every year, but we can prove we are right on their heels. This amendment will require review of these new scams as a type carriers may lawfully block. It also ensures that the federal government is working in unison with the state and foreign government counterparts and the private sector to end these tactics. I urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment and the underlying bill, and all our constituents are demanding action. Let's get this done. I appreciate it very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Ms. Clark, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Clark, do you yield back?
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any other member seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank Representatives Clark and Bilirakis for leading on this important issue. I'm pleased to work with you on your bill, the Ending One-Ring Scams Act of 2019. This amendment would improve this bipartisan bill by empowering the Department of Justice to crack down on robocallers trying to scam and defraud consumers through malicious charges. One-ring scams are yet another type of scheme robocallers have come up with to target victims and trick them out of their hard-earned savings. Scammers who use spoofing techniques to mask their number to call from another country can rack up even higher charges. While robocalls are annoying enough, forcing unsuspecting consumers to suffer financial harm adds insult to injury. I'm pleased to be taking action today on this important topic to protect consumers from these financial harms. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any other member that wishes to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, we will proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed will signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to this legislation? For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 36.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3375 offered by Mr. Soto of Florida. Page
Without objection,
21.
the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, these robocalls are like the annoying fly that our constituents can't seem to swat. And they're not only spam calls, but they're also scam calls. And that's what really troubles me when we're talking about our seniors and persons with mental disabilities and others who can fall victim to these types of scams. So it's time for us to get organized. The Spam Calls Task Force Act of 2019 was introduced by my colleague, Representative Charlie Crist, along with myself and others, out of a concern, particularly for those seniors in Central Florida or in Tampa Bay, where Congressman Crist represents. And the idea is to put the Attorney General and the FCC to work, along with states, to improve the enforcement of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act of 1991, otherwise known as the TCPA. More specifically, requires the Attorney General, in consultation with the FCC, to convene an interagency working group to study the enforcement of the TCPA. Among other things, the task force shall, 1, determine how federal law and budgetary constraints inhibit enforcement of the TCPA. 2, identify existing and additional policies and programs to increase coordinating between the federal department and agencies and the states for enforcing and preventing violations of the TCPA. And 3, identifying existing and potential international policies and programs to improve coordination between countries in enforcing the TCPA and similar laws. And that is the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield to Chairman Pallone.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say that, or note that while Mr. Crist is not on the committee and that therefore not here to offer the amendment, that his efforts have meaningfully improved this legislation, and the DOJ needs to take a more serious look at robocall issues and enforcement. I think that this bill, now becoming an amendment with Mr. Soto, will go a long way towards that goal. So I'm glad we were able to include this important provision. I want to thank Mr. Soto for offering the amendment, and I yield back to Mr. Soto.
Mr. Soto, do you seek?
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, we'll move to a vote. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further bipartisan amendments to this legislation? If not, are there any members seeking recognition to offer an amendment? For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk labeled SU 033.
Madam Clerk, was the amendment submitted 2 hours in advance, and are there copies for distribution?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3375 offered by Ms. Eshu of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I made a mistake in partially in what I said in my opening statement today, and I want to correct it. I said that the robocall division was in a committee report at the Financial Services Committee. That's not correct. It's at the Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. but the news is still good. So I just want to correct that for the record. Mr. Chairman, I plan to withdraw this amendment and hopefully secure a commitment with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to work on it between now and the full committee. But I want to raise some additional robocall issues that we have not discussed. In the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, Congress created a loophole that exempts calls, quote, made solely to collect a debt owed to or guaranteed by the United States, unquote, from the protections of the TCPA. My amendment simply rescinds that loophole. This amendment is needed because borrowers with federal loans deserve the same protections from robocalls that other customers or consumers enjoy under the TCPA. This amendment also clears up legal uncertainty that recent court cases have created with respect to the TCPA, and I've made reference to this at other hearings, and I think that this is an important step to clean up these legal uncertainties. Borrowers and their families have been harassed by student loan servicers and debt collectors using the 2015 loophole. I can share with you a whole raft of anecdotes. I don't think anyone's going to raise their hand and say, Anna, please read them all out. But they are real stories of what's happened to people. And it's across the country, it's deep, it's broad, and it contributes mightily to this gigantic number of robocalls that are made. Why? Because the federal government puts out loans to many, many people. We have student loans, we have agricultural loans, we have mortgage loans. I mean, I could go on and on. I think members know what I'm referring to. So it's whether it's a student loan, whether it's at other areas, the debt collectors have disrupted people's lives, and they really are persistent. They're persistent, and they threaten people on top of it. And when they sound like they have the force of the government, it really terrifies people. So this amendment protects millions of people across the country, including students who take out federal loans and their families. But I think the most important part of this is that it protects the TCPA from legal vulnerabilities. The TCPA is the basis for almost all federal statutory robocall protections. This year, 2 court cases, one at the Fourth Circuit Court and another at the Ninth Circuit, found the loophole that Congress created in 2015 violates the First Amendment. Unfortunately, both cases found this provision to be severable from the rest of the TCPA. The next court could find the 2015 loophole unconstitutional, but not severable from the rest of TCPA. And that would bring down nearly all of the robocall protections we have today. So by rescinding this 2015 loophole, this amendment protects, as I said, the TCPA. So I commend the committee and the subcommittee leadership for finding, bipartisan compromises, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to advance everything that we've had prior to my offering this amendment, and I hope that I can. I think the issues that I've raised are really relevant, and they walk right into our constituents' lives. There's no question about that. And so what I'd like to do is I'm willing to withdraw this amendment and to ask Mr. Latta and Mr. Walden to work with me before we have the markup in the full committee to find a bipartisan solution. I know that some members have some discomforts, and what exactly they are, I'm not sure, but I think that it's serious and we need to sit down and talk about it. So I'll yield the time to, I don't think, is Greg here? No, Mr. Ladd is here. Oh, you're both here. There you are. You were leaning back there, Greg.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek to be recognized?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's
Well,
recognized
thank you
for
very
5
much,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. And to my friend, the lady from California, door's always open, always willing to sit down with you.
Wonderful. Mr. Walden.
The gentleman had yielded, yes, absolutely, we're happy to talk, and to look at other laws that govern these sorts of calls as well, see the whole look at it, so, but we're
I
happy
thank
to.
both of the gentlemen very much, and Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does the
I'll,
gentlelady wish to withdraw her
I'll
amendment?
withdraw my amendment and yield back.
Gentlelady with yields back. Chair, for what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Oh, Chairman, I just wanted to strike the last word on the underlying
Gentleman's
bill.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, I want to thank all of our members for working together in such a collaborative and bipartisan way to tackle illegal robocalls. Implementing a nationwide call authentication system with no additional line item charge to consumers will help consumers again trust that the number they see on their caller ID is actually the person calling them, and this legislation does so in a way that doesn't leave rural Americans behind. Beyond that, this bill will take a number of steps to help put consumers back in charge of their own phone numbers. That means ensuring that calls are made with consent, that robocallers can't circumvent the law just by using new technologies, and that consumers can block illegal calls. And with blocking, we ensure transparency, consistency, and consumer control so that the calls people want to receive get through. Collectively, this legislation will take steps to ensure that law enforcement and the FCC have the tools, information, and incentives to go after robocallers that break the law. And these are common sense, meaningful solutions that can help restore trust in our phone system and help put consumers back in charge. These solutions are supported by trusted consumer groups like the National Consumer Law Center and Consumer Reports, as well as many of the carriers and their associations. So again, I just want to thank Ranking Member Walden, Subcommittee Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, for working with me on H.R. 3375 and for their leadership in combating this terrible problem. And with that, I urge my colleagues to favorably report this bill to the full committee, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3375 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 3375 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed will signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. H.R. 3375 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. The chair now requests unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record: a letter from Consumer Reports, a letter from a coalition of consumer groups, a letter from CUNA, and a letter from NAFCU. Without objection, so ordered. This markup is adjourned.
There we go. Without much intimidation.